Our last day to look at this, the Bible and foreign policy. We asked, what is a nation? We asked, how does God interact with nations? And we said that a nation, at a minimum, is, in order to exist or remain a nation, must possess a unifying characteristic or characteristics. And we said that about families as well. There are unifying characteristics that combine a family, that unite a family. Common mother and father used to be one of them. Have you noticed that family is getting harder and harder to define? Have you noticed that? And people say, well, you know, we went on a camping trip and it was like a family. Wait a minute, you and a bunch of friends were a family? And so I think the same thing's happened with nation. What actually is a nation? And a nation, according to our discussion from James Jordan, is a body of people usually living in the same place, sharing a common faith and culture. Common faith and culture is important, and desiring a common and separate government. Obviously, families are like that too, right? Do all families govern themselves the same way? Absolutely not. They don't. In order to be a family, you have to have certain things that you do, but it's not true in every single case. We asked, how does God interact with nations? We said God has established nations, and God will bless and curse nations as nations. We said that. That is clear in the Bible. We also said that God will convert all nations. Now, we talked about international law, and we'll talk about that this morning. We said John Eismo talks about the law of nations. We're going to talk about that a little bit from the Bible here this morning, and hopefully be finished by 1:15. I think we can. Apologize again for not having this in front of you, but I think we'll be fine. We said that international law exists, or the law of nations exists. That God never ever intended, and you'll hear this from different places, but God never ever intended for the Israelite nation to be limited in their laws to just the Israelites. And for example, we used Nineveh, right? Nineveh gets converted. What laws do you think Nineveh then goes by once Nineveh is converted? And we think historically Nineveh basically stayed converted for about 100 years. We said the book of Nahum is also addressed to Nineveh. Oftentimes in the Bible we think there's only one prophet that went to Nineveh. It was actually two. Jonah, of course, was the first one. Nahum comes along later and pronounces judgment on Nineveh for turning their back on God. But what laws would Nineveh go by once they become converted? I mean, do they go back? Do they repent? Do they go back to child sacrifices? You know, now we're going to worship the new God the same way? No. Obviously, the law applied to them. And we also said, when you look at Amos, when you look at Jeremiah especially, we see God condemning the nations in the same language as he condemns the children of Israel for violating his law. Any questions so far? Okay, moving on. We talked briefly about the missionary John Paton. I want to come back to him if we have to, but I want to use a couple of examples first of all. I want to talk about these examples, some of which may surprise you, but my point this morning is that foreign policy, and we made this point in the very beginning, foreign policy is a matter of the gospel. It is a matter of evangelizing the nations. And I am going to try to make the case this morning that foreign policy has to be seen through the eye of evangelism to all nations. Now, obviously the UN, obviously our State Department, this is obviously the last thing on their minds. I'm going to try to make that case this morning. We've already looked at Deuteronomy. I always forget this reference. John, it's Deuteronomy 7, right? It's 4, 7 and 3, 4, 7. I do that every time. Where I said that God says or Moses says to the children of Israel that God gave them those laws to be an example to other nations. What was the example? It didn't stop with justice. The justice was a means to an end. The end was to have that God that near to you. That was the end. The means was justice. The end was God converting these nations there in Deuteronomy, which we looked at before. Now, a couple points I want to make. First of all, every nation is going to have some type of foreign policy. What's that foreign policy going to be based on? Is it going to be based on evangelism? It's usually based on some sort of power. right? Which is what pagans always have done, right? I mean, Attila the Hun, whoever, right? You get to be powerful, you get to get money, you get power over other people. This is what people generally do. And so then their foreign policy is usually an extension of their domestic policy. Does that make sense? Power, preservation. I think we saw that in the study we did on Afghanistan. I think that's, if I could maybe, and anybody can comment on that, especially if you want to, Conrad, because you taught the class. But if there was a definition of what was going on in Afghanistan, it just looked to me like one power grab after another. That was it. Just one guy grabs power, consolidates it, and what do we mean by consolidating power? Usually, class. Kill the other people. It's a consolidate power is a nice way to say it. We consolidate power. What's that?
Kill your competitor.
Yeah. Kill them, drive them into exile, embarrass them, whatever, right? That's what it means. And we were all together there in the when we were studying Afghanistan. That's what impressed me about Afghanistan. It's one guy after another. I mean, it's like, new guy, same program. Different name that sounds hard to pronounce. Killing off the other people until he gets killed off, and then they whatever. So, but I'm arguing that generally speaking, foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. Gain power, kill off your competitors, and then in foreign policy, what you try to do is the same thing. You go and you try to destabilize another country, for example. If another country, and Sun Tzu talks about this, Machiavelli talks about this, right? If you have another country that is that you think is a competitor is going to give you problems, what do? You go and you try to mess with it. You try to mess with them. Maybe you send provocateurs. Maybe you pay foreign agents to try to mess with them. And why shouldn't you do that? They're probably doing that to you, right? So you might as well. This is what, in foreign policy, that's how it works. Now, I said earlier that everybody has foreign policy. I want you to hear this. This is from the Nicaraguan Revolution. They brought socialism to Nicaragua in the 70s and in the 80s, and this is what they had to say. This is by Humberto Belli, who left the communists and wrote about it, and it's a very enlightening book. Some of us are old enough to remember this. Some are not. Through there, he says this: two other noteworthy goals of the 1977 platform of the communists in Nicaragua include establishing a foreign policy of, quote, independence and support for the progressive and revolutionary causes of mankind. Pretty broad, right? We're going to do what we want to support what we did right here to mankind. Now, why would you do that? Why? Obviously because you want everybody to have, I guess, the same kind of wonderful revolution as you just had. Now, what's my point? My point here is that Christians, we can be criticized for having a Christian foreign policy. Why do you want to have a Christian foreign policy? Well, why does anybody want to have any foreign policy at all? And why do these guys, who just said they were concerned about Nicaragua, why do they want to have a foreign policy and spread whatever they had to everybody else in the world too? See, everybody has a foreign policy based on something. Everybody does. Question is, what's it going to be based on? Is it going to be based on evangelism and the gospel and promotion of loving one's neighbor? Or is it going to be based on power and the consolidation of power? After all, what is another name for the communists? We know that the Nazis were the National Socialists. What were the communists? They were the International Socialists. Remember the French Revolution? The reason why the Dutch and the English were concerned was because the French Revolution, they weren't going to keep it just to France. They were trying to spread it all over the place. Yes? not to be argued about here, but I don't see them as in the same way. I don't. We have not heard, boy, I don't want to get off on this too much. We have not heard about the efforts that were made, the peace efforts. For example, I'll take 90 seconds. Rudolf Hess flies to Germany with a peace, with, what's that? Flies to England. Did I say fly to Germany? Excuse me. Flies to England with a peace proposal. He gets put in jail, died here, what, maybe 6, 8 years ago, and was never allowed once to talk about it. Why? There's just some stuff in there we haven't heard a whole lot about, for example. But anyway, we can talk about that some other time. That's going to be next class. By the way, what's that? Yeah, conspiracy theory. Let's all. Yeah, that should be fun. Yeah, but there's a lot there. One historian says that Goebbels was not the best. He was not the best propagandist. Our propagandists were better than Goebbels. But anyway. Anyway, that's a different story. Next week, by the way, today's the last day on this. Next week we'll look at church finances, and then we're looking forward. Or no, next week is fellowship. After that, church finances. After that, our friend and compatriot Jeremiah Eldridge will be teaching a short class on discipleship, to which we're looking very much forward to that. And so that's what's happening next. Okay, back to this. We said that international law is evangelistic based on what we saw in Deuteronomy. I want to give you another, I want you guys to respond to this. Okay, I'm going to get a statement on international law from Ezra. Now, the book of Ezra is a very international book. You have all kinds of letters and stuff going back and forth, and Ezra is interesting because you actually have the text of the letters being written back and forth from the king and from Ezra and from the priests and so forth about what they're allowed to do. And what happens is after they come back and they begin to settle, Ezra is appalled because they begin to intermarry with the surrounding nations again. And Ezra is appalled at this. I want to read to you what he says in terms of an international law statement, or at least a foreign policy statement for the children of Israel. Check this out. Ezra 9. They've begun work on the temple. Ezra's pretty excited that things seriously seem to be progressing, but there's a real problem. Let me get my glasses so I can read this. Verse 8, he's confessing the fact that verse 1, they've married again to the surrounding people. Verse 1, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with respect to the abominations of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, so that the holy seed is mixed with the peoples of these lands. Indeed, the hand of the leaders and rulers has been foremost in this trespass. When I heard this thing, I tore my garment and my robe, plucked out some of the hair of my head and beard, and sat down astonished. Now you'll notice in verse 1 that that sounds just like Leviticus, just like Exodus. Abominations, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, and so forth. Now, so this is what's happening in domestic policy. Domestic policy is we do not mix with these people. Let's see, though, he's going to make a comment on foreign policy. Let's see. I want you to think about this. So he goes on. He says in verse 8, now for a little while grace has been shown to us from God to leave us a remnant to escape. Verse 9, we were slaves. Verse 10, now, our God, what shall we say after this? We have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded. Verse 12, here we go, foreign policy. Now, therefore, do not give your daughters as wives for their sons, nor take their daughters to your sons. That's domestic policy. Next phrase, and never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it as an inheritance to your children forever. All right. All of you are now counselors, to the President of the United States. And he wants a foreign policy statement from you. And you're going to give him one based on that verse that we just read. What's your foreign policy statement going to sound like? Keep going.
George Washington's farewell address, he warned the nation not to engage in angling alliances with the Europeans. Just keep your nose out of other people's affairs. Tend to your knitting and stay home.
Does that sound like a little bit like what we just read? I mean, does that almost sound like not even Christian? Right? Never seek their peace or prosperity. Yes.
What would be meant by alliance? Is that any type of interaction with them? Is that engaging in transactions?
No, never meant that. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't think so.
Yeah.
An alliance, you ally with people to jointly defend their borders. So you would enter into an alliance with Egypt to fight with Syria.
So it's strictly war related.
Typically it's for defense and those kinds of relations. So that would be seeking someone else's peace, that you would ally with them.
Right. That's what an alliance is, right? I mean, a treaty. I'm going to guarantee your peace. If they mess with you, they're going to mess with me.
Trade treaties and other kinds
Right.
of treaties.
Yes. That's right, which you have all the time. And we know that that was legitimate because we know from the book of Nehemiah, and Ezra and Nehemiah were contemporaries, that Nehemiah had no problem, I'm saying encouraged, he had no problem whatsoever with trading, buying and selling with the other nations. No problem. But it was these alliances of mutual defense that Washington hated. And it sure looks like Ezra is saying you better not do. But, we need to think about this because that's a foreign policy statement here. You mean you're not supposed to seek these other nations' peace or prosperity? Isn't that what we Christians do? So we need to think about this a little bit. Yes, Jeremiah.
This might be a different context.
Yeah. I actually think it's saying the same thing. Here's why I say that. The next verse here, and I want to come back to that, because that was Jeremiah's message, which they didn't like at the time. The whole time it was, you know what? Jeremiah was saying, this is not really about the Babylonians. This is about your infidelity to God, and this is just his chastisement against you. It's not really about them. They're just here at frankly, at the request of God. But you're supposed to go there, and you're still supposed to worship the true God. If you worship the true God, if you do the right thing, then they will have their peace and prosperity. And see, this is what I believe is being taught here. Next verse. Do not give your sons, your daughters, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it as an inheritance to your children forever. If they did obey God, then the other, as Deuteronomy 4 says, then the other nations see it, and that's how you get the peace and prosperity. In other words, I think Ezra's saying you're not going to get peace and prosperity by intermarrying. Now that's how pagans did it all the time. That's what Solomon was doing. Most of Solomon's alliances were, and the Europeans did this all the time. This isn't well known, but this is foreign policy again. Does anybody know why, except for John, can't answer this, not allowed, why people thought that George III, the King of England, that the colonists had the problems with, and remember, the colonists were not so much against England as much as they were against George III. Does anybody know why many people think, aside from his actions, that the man really had problems with his sanity? Anybody know why that is? I mean, people thought he was crazy. There's certain things he did that made him look crazy. Anybody ideas on this? It has to do with what we're talking about here. That's your hint. It'll be hard to figure out. The European powers consistently were constantly marrying. Here is Charles, Henry VIII, marrying Catherine of Aragon. Aragon is basically modern-day Spain. Why? Can't you find a good English girl? Henry? Well, no, a good English girl is good because, see, we have to marry someone from Spain, so they won't attack their own family, see? So if we marry someone from Spain, then our kids will be half Spanish, and the people from Spain won't want to attack us because they'll be attacking their own kids. And so they're always constantly doing these foreign policy arranged marriages. Oftentimes they were arranged because they thought that that making these marriages would cause them not to fight with each other. Did you know this? And what happened was, since they were arranged marriages and the marriages were based on alliances, what happened in Europe was, after a while, some of these alliances became like, or some of these marriages became like, am I allowed to say Arkansas? Am I allowed to say? Yeah, close to incestuous, right? Cousins and all kinds of crazy stuff. And bad things happen when that happens, right? Right, Dave? Dave would know this. Yes.
When World War I,
Not Dave's family, but
not Dave's family.
but for the circle, the circle. I mean, it happens in some of these plain circles.
When World War I broke out, almost every country involved in World War I was related. The leadership, they were all related to Queen Victoria.
Who had whose husband was German,
Yes.
and they had like 10 kids.
So the Romanov family in Russia was related to the English, was related to the French, was related to the Austrians, was related to the Serbians, they were all related.
Mm-hmm.
But they had different alliances,
Yeah.
and it all exploded because of the alliances.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's why they were all drawn in, because so the alliances instead of guaranteeing peace, in that case, guaranteed war.
Kaiser Wilhelm. I mean, most of these people were cousins. Most of them.
Yep.
In those-
Yeah, fighting each other.
Fighting
Yeah.
each other.
So the pagan idea is get related to each other and guarantee peace. Ezra is going straight against that, I believe, and saying, no, obey God. That's what's going to bring peace, not just to you, but to, in this case, the Babylonians. Okay, yeah. I don't mean to say, and I know we did talk about it a little bit. I'm saying the way the pagans do it is by power.
Right, yeah, no,
Oh,
I
okay.
wasn't thinking you were saying Christians.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Either by power or by evangelism.
Okay. As a motivation of foreign policy, yes, yeah. Oh,
Like instead of seeking their peace and wealth, obey God and then He will teach you all.
right. Okay.
And be able to
Yes.
see that.
Yes. Yes.
Is
Yes.
that what you
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying yes, and I can't emphasize that strong enough that the first evangel that I know of in the Scripture in Deuteronomy chapter 4, where God says other people see your great God, and they'll want to find out about him. That the first evangelism comment that I know of in the Scripture is actually based on example, which is I believe what you're saying here, if I understand. Evangelism actually starts with example,
Yeah,
which is not how we think of this.
I'm understanding what you're saying.
Yeah.
I have the thought. That's what we did for
I guarantee I sure did. And I still remember when I was a youth pastor and I saw this. I was thinking, wait a minute. We're talking about national conversion. I mean, we're used to like one-on-one conversion. Nothing wrong with that. But here's a verse based on national conversion, converting nations here. I remember seeing that. So I never really thought about that. I took the Pentateuch in Bible college and don't remember studying that, but maybe we did. Yes.
I think that
Oh man. Oh my
Deuteronomy
word.
Deuteronomy 4:6, where it talks about surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people, being said by the other. I think it's a parallel to Romans 11:11 when Paul's talking about, I say then they did not stumble as to fall, that they may it never be, but by their transgression salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. It's kind of a parallel.
Sure.
And that's what we're talking about.
Sure. Yeah.
Because people see it.
Yeah.
People are drawn to it because you have peace,
Yeah.
but you have peace because of this, not
Right.
because of an alliance.
Right. Yeah, I like I say, Jeremiah, I still remember thinking, wait a minute, God's law is evangelistic? I never heard anything like that before in my life. God's law leads other people to Christ? I'd always heard God's law is kind of like the enemy, quite frankly, of evangelism. That's pretty much what I had heard. All right, I want to do this very quickly. We have just a few minutes left here. I want to talk about sort of the development of Christian foreign policy in the few minutes that we have left. And very, very quickly here, I believe it's I do this here. Here we go. Page 278 here. This has to do with the problem that the Spanish theologians had to deal with when Cortez went to Mexico. And we'll just try to do this real quickly. Cortez, of course, is the bad guy in your history books. He's the guy that went and just messed with those peace-loving Aztecs. And everything was wonderful. And here comes Hernando Cortez in the Spanish, and they've got, and they discover pyramids of human skulls in town after town. They discover jails where they were fattening people up to eat them, right? And of course, in our history books, Cortez is the bad guy. Don't send your kids to be taught by those people. Anyway, but they ran into problems because what would you do? Okay, you go to Mexico, right? And here are, you have some sort of godly history here. You're Roman Catholic, but there's some sort of Bible back there. And you run into a human sacrifice. And here are the Aztecs parading people up steps. The steps are just covered in congealed blood. You can't walk up them without stepping into it and sticking to your feet, right? And you just come in on this. What do? You're like, hey, you know what? We don't get involved. Not us. What do you do about that? You're a professing Christian. What do you do? Or you come to a prison, and within the prison are people that they are fattening up to eat. What do? Like, hey, we don't get involved here. What do you do? This was a problem because some of the Spanish soldiers acted. Some weren't sure what they were supposed to do. How about something not quite so much? How about you go to a different country and all the husbands treat their wives like slaves? Slaves. John Payton here talks about, we don't have time to talk about this morning. This is our last day, but he details here wife killing. It talks about one guy who just killed his wife. And the missionary challenges him when he says, well, she disagreed. He looked at John Payton like he's an idiot. She disagrees with me. She can't do that. So he killed her. And about a week later, he married another woman and went on his merry way. What do you do? Well, this particular Dominican priest and professor of theology at Spain's leading university came up against these problems, and we'll try to handle all these problems very quickly. And again, my underlying point is you cannot have a consistent foreign policy that's Christian unless you understand the primacy of a Christian nation to begin with. If you don't understand the primacy of a Christian nation, you can't have a Christian foreign policy, right? It makes no sense. So they had this problem. What do we do? And Vittoria analyzed the various theories advanced by Spain to justify the conquest of the Americas, rejecting most but ultimately accepting two. Now we believe no conquest is ever justified, right? He's going to justify at least two reasons for conquest. And by the way, pretty much everybody who attacks, let's say, the British Empire for some sort of conquest They believe in conquest on themselves, but that's a different story. First, it was argued that the Native Americans had no legitimate governments and therefore no legitimate claims to sovereignty because of their status as infidels and idolaters. Vittoria rejected this argument, noting that civil authority does not depend upon personal regeneration and that even Christian monarchs do not lose their authority because of certain sins. Do you see how he's trying to develop a foreign policy here? People said, you know, we can conquer those people because they don't have legitimate authority anyway. He said, no, this is not good enough. Next, he considered the argument adopted from Aristotle that Native Americans lacked the intelligence or power of reason to govern themselves and therefore were rightfully slaves of others. Did you know Aristotle argued that? Aristotle, who is praised in our social science centers, argued that some were born to be masters and some were born to be slaves. And that's that. And Vittoria rejects that. And I won't say what he says, but he says no. Next, he looked at the authority of Rome. That's an easy one. Some people said that Rome, since it's the head of Christianity at the time, has authority over these Native Americans, Indians. And Vittoria said, no, not really. And then they called the Pope as a vicar of Christ. He says, nope, that's not going to work. And then some tried to compare the Spanish conquest of Americas to the Israelite conquest of Canaan. If the Israelites can conquer Canaan, then we can conquer them. And Vittoria says, no, not even. What he does do, he then turned on two bases which he said could justify the conquest. Foreign policy here. And we'll wrap it up with this. We have 2 or 3 minutes. One, such justification arose when innocent persons were unjustly condemned to death, as in the widespread Aztec human sacrifices. So the number one reason why we can conquer these people, they're killing innocent people, they're doing it consistently. That justifies us putting a stop to it. Of course, that indicates that that's what you're going to do, right? Otherwise, if you just go over there and they keep doing the same thing, but only now you're in control, you've done nothing. So then it can't be justified. Yes, Ryan? Oh, okay. Second, and then we'll wrap it up with this, and I want you to hear this, and this is kind of like the encapsulation of all I'm trying to say in this brief study here. And I believe that what he says next is what justifies intervention in foreign countries. The second justification concerned the right to preach and hear the gospel. Since all men and women have a common ancestry in Adam and Eve, all people have a basic right to travel and sojourn among other nations and communicate and trade with people of those nations. This right applies equally regardless of religion. Christian princes may not prevent Muslims or Jews from trading in Christian lands, any more than Muslims or Jews may prevent Christians from trading in their lands. If foreign princes try to prevent Spaniards from exercising these rights, Spaniards must first use peaceful means to try to persuade them to follow the law of nations. But if they are unable to persuade them, they may secure these rights by force. Now, another theologian said this, and we'll wrap it up with this. The gospel message cannot be received unless it be freely preached and the peoples be free to accept it. In other words, does every person, let me ask you this, does every living person, no matter where they are, have a right to hear the gospel preached? We must answer that question before we develop any foreign policy at all. And the second question is like unto it. Do they also have a right to preach it? I myself answer absolutely yes to both questions, and I think the theologian got it right. If anybody anywhere is preventing the gospel being preached, then I believe Christian foreign policy should be aimed at getting the gospel into that country. Now, does it allow for conquest, as you know, the killing and so forth, invasion and so forth? Not in every case, I'm sure. It was a little bit easier in this case because the Aztecs were just killing everybody. That's why Cortez got so much support, right? See, this is not taught in our history books. Cortez with a couple of Spanish guys, a couple of horses, a couple of funny-looking helmets, and blunderbusses that were hardly even accurate at all, goes and conquers an entire country the size of Mexico. Think he did that on his own? No, he had all kinds of support from the local Indian nations that were tired of getting put into slavery by the Aztecs, and they supported Cortez. So that's a little bit easier. But I would argue today that a Christian foreign policy has to begin with that idea that all have the right to hear the gospel preached. They all have that right to hear it. Once you have that in your head, I think your foreign policy goals become a lot more clear. All right, I've gone a little bit over time. Questions?